Did you know that between 1895 and 1937, 93 men were executed behind the walls of Folsom Prison? But their stories, they weren't lost to time. They just needed a voice. Welcome to Falling Through the Trap, where we dive into the deep, often unsettling waters of historical true crime, as well as our criminal justice system, both past and present. I'm April Moore, author and criminal justice professional, and I invite you on a journey through the human stories buried in prison records, newspaper headlines, courtroom transcripts, and so much more. I'm not just recounting cases. I'm probing into justice's paradoxes and presenting humanity found in a place we're told there isn't any: prison. Through the stories of these 93 men, we'll look at history, ethics, and certainly the death penalty, and whether or not it should have a place in America's present and future. Welcome to episode 12. A little note before I jump in. Over the course of about 17 years, I've accumulated well over, 1 million words of notes. That's just newspaper accounts. It could be 2 million for all I know. And then there's trial and other court transcripts, reports, applications for pardon, and so many other documents. Needless to say, it is overwhelming. When I sent the final manuscript of the book to the publisher back in 2012 or 13, it was really only after about 4 or 5 years of research, which might sound like a lot, and it certainly did to me then. But when it comes to this many stories, I guess not really. Plus, I didn't focus too much on the various connections between secondary characters or overlapping events. Some obvious ones, sure, but it wasn't until I was preparing for a rewrite in 2020 that I found so much more information, documents, and resources that weren't available to me back then, or I just didn't know about. And I started paying more attention to people who would pop up in more than one case. Some I knew, like judges, law enforcement, lawyers, which I didn't really see the extent of either. And then there were townspeople, jury members, family members of previous victims, and so on. The number of paths that crossed was astounding, and I doubt I'm even aware of half of them, which I need to just get over. A lot of these crimes occurred in small towns, made up of large pioneering families. They worked in law enforcement, owned stores, worked in local government, so of course they'd pop up everywhere. And then they'd marry into other pioneer families, which was like untangling a yarn store after a tornado ripped through. And it didn't help that women didn't have first names then. They were Mrs. John Brown, and so that's a whole other tangent I won't go into right now. So I acknowledge that I am the only one who probably finds these connections fascinating. And that's just going to happen when you're studying these cases for as long as I have. And I tend to hyper-focus on a winding trail. Honestly, it's how I nerd out. But I will not belabor these connections for all of you. Most aren't that significant, and there isn't going to be a test. If you remember, great. If you don't, it's fine. I can live with that. The reason I bring this up now is because this case was where many, many secondary characters began their shared involvement in other cases, the extent of which I didn't even catch until I started pulling this episode together. So then what do? I stop and start a new line of inquiry and put off the release of the episode until my neuroses is satisfied that I found what I need and can move on. I wanted to explain why I often veer into random land by saying, hey, you might remember from episode whatever. I don't expect you to remember. This is really just for me, but I will try to keep it as relevant as possible most of the time. I know my fellow history nerds will get it, and I appreciate those of you who put up with it. I think one of the goals of this podcast, aside from getting through all the stories of these 93 men with bonus episodes thrown in, is to eventually look at it as a whole and see it as almost this living, breathing thing made up of millions of intertwining components, both big and small and even microscopic. Its own little universe, like a Folsom verse, I guess. At the risk of sounding selfish, I do this podcast for me. For more reasons than one, my brain just needs to purge all of this stuff, and I want a record of it that's in one place. But I also want to be mindful of my wonderful, loyal listeners, so please know I will do my best. So, as I've said, there are several characters in this story who will reappear in upcoming episodes, and I will try to be brief about it. So, with that, let's get on with the show. This one is about William Henry Glover, Folsom's 15th execution, February 6th, 1904. Edward J. Livernash, reporter for the San Francisco Examiner, eyed 13-year-old Elizabeth Agnes Nierhoff, the black-haired beauty sitting across from him. Her mother, Mina, sat next to her. She is as tall as the average woman, he later told his readers, and as mature in appearance as most girls of 18, this central figure in a strange tragedy. On June 16, 1902, Livernash came to the Nierhoff's small farmhouse in the picturesque foothills 2 to 3 miles outside Auburn to get a first-hand account of what happened on June 11th. Livernash, along with his hungry readership, wanted to know what led to William Glover, the girl's 26-year-old former fiancé, killing her father, Johann Frederick Nierhoff. Aside from the murder, the curious public wanted to know how the nearly 14-year-old became engaged, let alone to a man twice her age. Just as Livernash observed, other newspapers would make note of the young teen's mature appearance. "She is a remarkable girl," the Placer Herald wrote, "not yet 15 years in age. She appears to be 20 and talks and acts it." Mrs. Nierhoff explained to the reporter that the family became acquainted with Glover, along with his older brother Oscar, through a mining claim the brothers had on the Nierhoff property. "He was pleasant of manner and a good violinist," she said, "and we were not unwilling to have him call." She said he often came to the house where he and Agnes, as the girl went by, would entertain the family, which included 3-year-old Hilda, with music and dance. "There was not a cloud in our sky," Mina added. The two lovebirds were planning to marry the following January. I couldn't actually find much of anything on William Glover before all of this, other than that he was born in Iowa, had 2 older brothers, and they came to California in 1896. Johann, or Frederick, as he went by, the 62-year-old German native, himself 22 years older than his wife Mina, and that might have been why he tolerated Glover's fondness for his daughter. He wasn't overly pleased, but he didn't seem to dislike Glover, and even invited him to stay with them when Glover needed a place to live a few months prior. In early June, Mina went to Sacramento for a medical procedure, taking Hilda with her. After Mama's departure, Agnes told Livernash, things went on about as before, and there were no signs of trouble until last Tuesday. But even before that, on Sunday, June 8th, during a buggy ride together, Agnes ended the 6-month engagement after she grew wary of Glover, when he disclosed to her that he planned to shoot his brother Oscar. Over what, I am not sure, but it may have had to do with the mining claim that they shared. "I made up my mind," she said, "that I would never marry him, and had told him so. But he seemed to think he could change my mind, and I thought from his manner that he loved me more than ever. So on Tuesday, June 10th, Glover came to the house just as Agnes and her father were preparing for a trip to Auburn. He told the pair that he was going to San Francisco and wanted to say goodbye. Frederick was glad to see him go and said goodbye, adding, "I hope you never come inside my gate again." Then he forbade William from pursuing Agnes. As she recalled the scene for the reporter, Agnes shook her head. Oh, the look on Will's face when he heard Father's goodbye was terrible. He scowled dreadfully. It made me shiver. Sullen and silent, Glover turned and left. Agnes said she didn't know why her father suddenly disliked Glover, as she hadn't revealed to him why she called off the engagement, but she warned him, saying Will's look meant trouble. Her father replied that he wasn't afraid of William Glover. Around 6 the next morning, Agnes stood in the kitchen, listening to what sounded like someone moving about in the cellar. "I found I was not mistaken," she said, "for Will Glover came into the kitchen. He was carrying a shotgun." He told her he had come to kill her father. "When Will told me that, I wanted to warn my father right away," she said. "But Will came close to me and said that if I did anything suspicious, to let my father know, he'd kill me too. All day I tried and tried and tried to find a chance to speak to Father alone, but it was no use. I could not get anywhere without feeling that the gun was behind me or before me. It was terrible, terrible." Livernash told his readers, "The child tiptoed here and there, but the man with a heart of flame with love and murder followed like a shadow. And terror, the blank terror of a child, did the rest." Agnes explained how Glover managed to stay close but hidden, always in earshot of Frederick and his daughter as the two went about their day. No matter where Agnes went, Glover lurked, watching and listening, preventing her from even leaving the house while Frederick worked outside. When Agnes and her father ate breakfast and later lunch, Glover stood hidden behind a door with the gun. Around 3:30 that afternoon, Oscar, William's brother, arrived at the house carrying a horse collar he wished to exchange for one Frederick had in the barn. Inside the house, Will picked up a different rifle, a .44 Winchester belonging to Frederick, and said to Agnes, "Now is the time." She watched helplessly from the front window of the house as Frederick and Oscar emerged from the barn, and William, saying not a word, approached them, the shotgun aimed right at Frederick. The two men stopped, and Oscar said, "For God's sakes, Will, don't shoot." Frederick dropped the horse collar and also told William not to shoot. He took a step forward to take the rifle away from him, and William fired a shot that hit Frederick on his left side, the bullet going through his kidney and lodging itself in the base of his spine. What happened next was described during the coroner's inquest the day after Libernash's interview. Agnes, quote, "becomingly attired in black, was composed on the stand and, without hesitation, told how after the shooting, William came into the house and told her he killed her father because he had ordered him from the place. She briefly fainted, and after regaining consciousness, she looked out the window to see the brothers leaving. The other shotgun was still in the house. I grabbed the gun," she said, "and would have shot Will Glover if I had the strength." Instead, she pointed it at the men and demanded they carry her father, who was still alive, into the house. They did so, she said, and Father sent me for a jug of water. They laid him on blankets on the floor, and Will Glover placed a pillow under his head. The men proceeded to have a discussion on the front porch for several minutes, then returned. She recalled how Oscar, who had just looked on while the scene unfolded, now approached her and said, "When this comes into court, you can testify that it was an accident." She told him she wouldn't do it, and he allegedly replied, "You will, or I will shoot you." Then William said to her, "I wish your mother was here, and I would kill the whole band of you." Will then cleared the house of all photographs of himself, which reporters bitterly assumed was to keep them from being used in their newspapers. The men left the house, but picked up a club or tool handle laying near a tree to be used as evidence of self-defense. Confident in this plan, the brothers fetched Dr. T.M. Todd to tend to Frederick, and William turned himself in, along with the club and rifle, to Sheriff Charles Keena. The switching of rifles seemed to also be part of this plan. The first shotgun, one William had borrowed from a neighbor under false pretenses, of course, worked to keep Agnes quiet. If he had relied on using Frederick's, the man might notice it missing. But when it came time to kill him and claim self-defense, using the victim's shotgun might show no premeditation, that he happened to pick up right when he needed it. Dr. Todd could barely hold back tears when he described arriving at the Nierhoff home just after 6 p.m. to find Frederick, a close friend of his, so near death. Deputy Sheriff Leroy Cohn arrived, and Frederick was able to give a statement. "I ordered William Glover off the place and not bother my girl. The girl was going to town, and I told him he could not ride with her and never to come into my gate again. He went off, and I told the girl to go in the house, and I would go to town with her. That was Tuesday, the day before." Frederick then explained how before that, on Sunday, William wanted Agnes to go with him to Bear River where he had a job, and that Frederick wouldn't let her go out there, but evidently allowed them to travel to Auburn. Frederick said, "They went up to Glover's and they changed the horse collars up there and brought back a collar that was not mine. Today, Oscar Glover came and asked about the collar. We went into the barn and looked at the collar, and Oscar said it was his. When we came out of the barn door, Will Glover was there with a gun in his hand. Oscar says, 'Don't shoot.' I had the collar in my hand and threw it away and walked up to him and said, 'Don't shoot.' I was going to take the gun away from him, and he shot me. I did not have anything in my hand." Later, he was quoted as saying that he believed the shooting was a, quote, "put-up job" by both brothers. 2 hours later, Frederick Nierhoff passed away from internal bleeding. Terrified the Glovers would make good on their threats, Agnes had initially corroborated the brothers' story to Dr. Todd and Deputy Sheriff Cohn. The following day, she gave the same story to Deputy District Attorney J.L. Marks, but he didn't buy it. Even the community of Auburn found it implausible that, quote, "one feeble old man" could seriously injure either of the brothers, who were both physically strong and healthy. On Friday, she confessed to authorities that she lied and told how the Glover brothers threatened her. Oscar was then immediately arrested pending an investigation, but they'd had their own suspicions about Oscar's involvement, given his strength and agility. Why didn't he take on Frederick if he indeed was going after William? Or why didn't he stop his brother? Agnes also claimed that the club, introduced as inquest evidence, wasn't the same one the men picked up and took with them. An inquest spectator noted, "Agnes was the coolest 14-year-old girl I have ever seen," while her mother, newly widowed, wept throughout the proceeding. One paper wrote, "William Glover sat behind his attorney's chair during the young lady's testimony and looked squarely at his accuser as she recited the details of her father's death. The stern gaze of her former lover did not disturb the young woman at all, and she looked into the face of the man who was to be her husband unflinchingly. Neither William nor Oscar testified at the inquest. It wasn't surprising when the coroner's jury determined that, with premeditation and with no provocation, William killed Mr. Nierhoff, and that Oscar was an accessory to the crime. Both men pleaded not guilty, and each were held over for separate trials the following September. William's trial opened first, and Agnes repeated the same story she told at the inquest and the subsequent preliminary examination, that she watched her father drop the horse collar, how his hands were empty, how he told William not to shoot, and that Will did anyway. She also said Oscar made no move to stop anything from unfolding. On cross-examination, defense attorney F.P. Tuttle focused heavily on her initial conflicting stories and the minor inconsistencies with her previous statements, but it didn't rattle Agnes. She remained calm and steady with her testimony. Sheriff Charles Keena testified that when William turned himself in, he handed the club and shotgun over to him and said, "I shot Mr. Nierhoff. I had to do it, for he came at me with this club." Oscar testified that when he and Frederick emerged from the barn, they saw William with a rifle and that Mr. Nierhoff came at William with a club, saying, "I will club your head off." He said he told his brother not to shoot, but insisted his brother warned Agnes's father to back off, but that the man kept advancing, leaving William with no choice but to shoot. Oscar also denied threatening Agnes and claimed that he and his brother weren't even on speaking terms when he came to see Frederick, so how could they conspire to kill the man? William Glover, for the first time, told his side of events when he took the stand on his own behalf. After the contentious conversation with Mr. Nierhoff the day before the killing, William had decided not to go to San Francisco, and unbeknownst to the family, returned late that night to the Nierhoff home to sleep. He arose at 4 a.m. to go rabbit hunting, using a rifle he had borrowed from a neighbor the day before. The neighbor did confirm that was the reason William gave him. Unsuccessful in the hunt, William said he returned to the house, avoiding the, quote, old gentleman, because he didn't want trouble, but stayed upon Agnes's insistence. But by 3:30, he had grown tired of hanging around the house, so he borrowed Frederick's rifle to take up the rabbit hunt again. And upon arriving in the yard, with the rifle over his shoulder, he encountered his brother and Mr. Nierhoff. He said Frederick came toward him with a club and that he warned the man to back off. "He came at me with a kind of a jump, and he tried to grab the gun," he said. "At the same time he started to strike me with the club, I shot him." Tuttle, in his closing argument, said Agnes had made enough conflicting statements to, quote, fill a Saratoga trunk, calling into question her truthfulness, saying that should her story be believed, she acted inhuman, and that it wasn't natural for a daughter to not intervene when a father's life was in danger. The jury deliberated for nearly 6 hours, differing not on guilt or innocence, but whether William deserved life imprisonment or the death penalty. In the end, they chose death. The Placer County Ledger described William's reaction. He turned slightly pale and seemed to have a slight choking sensation, but said nothing. As the sheriff walked beside him back to the prison, tears flowed from Glover's eyes, but he made no expression as he returned to his cell. A day later, the same paper wrote, "There has been but one conclusion, one opinion, and that was that the aged German was cruelly slain, and though Glover's legal defense was faultless, and every point that could be turned to his credit was noted, Yet all the legal ingenuity of his counsel, with the reasoning of the defendant's attorneys, and the logic with which they clothed their client's claims were of no avail. Justice was not so blinded nor skewed from the plain path of duty and giving the accused every advantage of the law that was due him. The scales which weigh all human acts fell on the side of guilt, and Glover was doomed to pay the penalty of his rash act with his life. According to the paper, members of the jury said they discarded Agnes's testimony, basing their decision on William's testimony and the dying statement of Mr. Nierhoff. This was exactly what the prosecution, in their closing argument, asked the jury to do. The paper noted that the last time Placer County had held a death penalty trial was 19 years prior, in 1883, the crime also in Auburn, and the accused was found guilty and hanged in the town's old courtyard. When I looked into it, I not only verified this, but I also came across a familiar last name. I knew it was in at least one later case, but turns out it was in this one and two others. The last name was Dependener, and in the 1883 case, it was Fred Dependener. As I said in the opening, small towns and pioneering families means they'll pop up everywhere. And considering that Fred Sr. and his wife Elizabeth, both from Germany, had 9 children, this family was everywhere. They began as a farming family in Auburn. Fred Jr. in his 20s was the one involved in the 1883 death penalty case, but just as a witness. This family not only dominated in size, as in numbers, but they dominated in height. This was a very tall family, a trait mentioned often in the papers over the years. And Frank Dependener, one of the children, in his mid-20s was, in 1895, deemed the tallest man in Placer County, standing 6'8". In fact, there was an article in the San Francisco Examiner that year called Sons of Goliath in the Golden State, with profiles and illustrations of California's tallest men, and Frank Dependener made the list. His imposing physique made him ideal for his job as a sheriff's deputy. He worked under his brother-in-law, Placer County Sheriff Charles Keena, and the two were involved not just in this case, but they will have very prominent roles in the cases involving executions number 19 and 20 and 23. On top of that, one of Frank's brothers, Benjamin, or Ben Dependener, enters into this story as well as a jailer. Then he had a major role in the case of number 23. This family was in the area for decades, and it appears that both Fred Sr. and Frank were affectionately known as Dip. And considering their notable stature, I like to think someone called them Big Dipper at one point. Anyways, back to William Glover. While public sentiment didn't side with William, it did lean more toward Oscar. Many believed he hadn't conspired with his brother. His day in court began September 22nd, and his attorneys, F.P. Tuttle and his brother Charles Tuttle, were joined by Hiram W. Johnson, the criminal defense attorney who in 1911, 9 years later, became California's 23rd governor. Then in 1917, began serving for the United States Senate until his death in 1945. Johnson figured into a few other of these cases as an attorney and as governor. And then we have Charles T. Jones, who assisted in the prosecution of Chin Hain, the prison's first execution, and then in the George Putman case, the 13th execution. Well, now he joined the prosecution against Oscar Glover. Jones would have a 30-year career in California as a deputy district attorney and assistant attorney general, and he was involved in the cases of, I believe, 14 of these 93 men. See, I can't get away from these connections. And Dr. Todd and Deputy Sheriff Leroy Cohn from this story will also appear in upcoming episodes. Oh, and the attorneys, the Tuttle brothers, they'll be back too. Anyway, so during the trial, both Agnes and Oscar gave virtually the same testimony as that at William's trial. He denied threatening Agnes or having any complicity in the matter. Agnes did add that she saw Oscar and another Glover brother, Charles, standing on the ditch above the Nierhoff home the day after the crime, seemingly to intimidate her. But his attorneys were sworn in to testify that Oscar was in their office at the time. And by the way, Charles Glover, the other brother, had his own minor run-ins with the law, but I won't go into those. The jury deliberated less than 30 minutes and acquitted Oscar of any involvement in Frederick Nierhoff's death. There simply wasn't enough evidence to connect him to it. Judge J.E. Pruitt sentenced William to die on December 12th, but his appeal to the California Supreme Court gave him a reprieve, and he was allowed to wait out his appeal in the Placer County Jail. Even Judge Pruitt will appear in a couple of upcoming cases. One in particular, number 23, will sort of put his name on the map. Over a year later, November 6, 1903, Reverend Charles F. Oler presided over the marriage of 15-year-old Agnes to 22-year-old Wallace Sutton. And guess what? 12 years later, Reverend Oler will have a very big role in the upcoming story of David Fountain, Folsom's 31st execution. I think that's it with the intermingling of people and cases, at least in this story. About a month after Agnes's nuptials, William lost his appeal. The state Supreme Court disagreed with his and his attorney's contention that William's mere claim of self-defense was sufficient to warrant a reversal of judgment. The court said that one can believe, based on appearances, they're in imminent danger, but acting upon those appearances, one does so at his own peril because, quote, the law leaves it to no man to be the exclusive judge of the reasonableness of the appearances upon which he acts. It's not enough to feel you're in danger, but the circumstances have to support such a claim. And to the jury, they didn't. The higher court also pointed out that it was William who took a rifle without words, approached the victim in a, quote, hostile demonstration. Enough, at least, to prompt his brother to say, don't shoot. If anyone had a right to claim self-defense, it was Frederick. William, called a model prisoner, was evidently well taken care of in the county jail. He arrived at his resentencing 50 pounds heavier. He reportedly never spoke ill of the Nierhoff family during his confinement, had only said that, quote, he had got the worst of it. He also always expressed the belief his sentence would be commuted. He was sentenced to hang February 6, 1904. Sheriff Keena and his brother-in-law, Ben Dependener, took Glover to Folsom. When Warden Archibald Yell, Folsom's 5th warden, came to William a few days before the execution to, quote, prepare him for the worst, Glover reportedly replied cheerfully, that's all right, Warden, but I ain't worrying. My reprieve will come at the last moment. You see if it don't. The Placer Herald wrote, he was so firmly convinced that his reprieve would come that he left his cell for the gallows with the implicit belief that just before the black cap would be slipped over his head, the doors would fly open, and an official messenger from the governor would appear waving his pardon papers and shouting, stop the execution. It was said that he was so confident that he slept like a child the night before. He did request and drank 2 glasses of whiskey that morning, and I doubt it was an early celebration of a reprieve. And so much to his disappointment, Glover, said to be the heaviest man hanged at Folsom thus far, went to the gallows at noon on Saturday, the fourth to be executed at the prison on a day other than Friday, and the only one on a Saturday. It also marked the first execution under Warden Yell. Oscar remained in the captain's office during the execution and claimed his brother's body, burying him at Old Auburn Cemetery. Oscar would go on to buy and renovate the Orleans Hotel in, I believe, Rockland in 1909. A year later, he was accused of refusing to care for an ill woman he was living with in Sacramento, shortly before her death. However, further records couldn't be found, and in 1917, Oscar passed away at the age of 51 of heart disease. Frederick Nierhoff didn't leave much aside from land and some personal property, which Mina, his widow, sold some of, but she remained on the land and continued farming until she passed in 1932 at age 70. Now Agnes. She had her first son in 1904, a daughter in 1906, and another son in 1910, who sadly passed away at 9 months old. Cause of death unknown. Another daughter was born in 1913. But in 1916, after 13 or so years of marriage, she and Wallace divorced, and she married another man that same year, and they had 2 sons together. The next record I could find was a 1957 marriage license between Agnes and her first husband, Wallace, when she was 68 and he was 75. They were married 10 more years until his death in 1967. She died 2 years later. On a weird side note, Agnes's sister Hilda, she was only 3 when her father was killed. At 16 in June of 1915, Hilda's mother, Mina, filed statutory rape charges against a man named George Rose on behalf of Hilda. He had been arrested in late May on statutory charges against 2 young girls, Hilda being one. He was also allegedly married. The deputy DA at the time was the son of F.P. Tuttle, one of Williams and Oscar's attorneys. Then in September, when the trial was to begin, the Placer Herald wrote, George Rose, accused of a statutory offense against Miss Hilda Nierhoff, has escaped trial by marrying the girl. George had evidently got a divorce from his wife and immediately married Hilda. And the paper noted that because she was now his wife, she couldn't be forced to testify against her husband. So the charges were dismissed. But the DA had him rearrested, pending charges regarding the other girl, but those were dropped the following month. I don't know for sure about his story. I think he was about 25 or 26 and enlisted in 1917. All I know is that Hilda was still Mrs. George Rose in 1918, then was granted a divorce in July 1920. On the same day, she got a marriage license to marry another man. She was 21 and he was 49. I don't know if these women in this family really liked their older men, but it certainly was a pattern. They had 2 daughters, 2 sons, and she passed in 1949 at age 50. Not much more to say about this case other than it just being a sad, senseless murder. I don't believe William's version of what happened. I can only assume he really didn't like Fred Nierhoff, wanted him dead, and he put a lot of faith in a self-defense claim. It's hard to say if he was hoping Agnes would go along with it or not, or if he just wanted revenge. Oscar's involvement is also a lot of conjecture. First of all, was this horse collar switcheroo on Sunday before part of the plan? A reason to get Oscar to the farm in order to be a witness to this so-called act of self-defense? Why did William say to Agnes when Oscar arrived, "Now is the time"? Was she in on it? Although I think if she was, the brothers would have definitely tried to throw her under the bus. Or was Oscar truly taken by surprise when Will appeared with the gun? But of course, he would stand by his brother. After all, it would be easy enough to silence the only witness, a 13-year-old girl. You also have to wonder why Oscar didn't intervene at all. It just all seemed to me a very convenient convergence of circumstances, including the absence of Mrs. Nierhoff and Hilda. Out of all of these cases involving the 93 men, about 10 claimed self-defense. Aside from Glover so far, just a couple, John Craig and John Howard. Today, self-defense is a fairly common legal defense strategy, but just as with these early cases, the courts have to consider a number of factors, such as imminent danger, reasonableness of the force one used, and whether or not the accused had an opportunity to escape this perceived danger. If the defendant is successful in asserting their self-defense claim in a murder case, often it results in manslaughter, a reduced charge. But truly justifiable homicide is relatively rare, between 400 and 500 per year, and that's private citizens. Law enforcement is, believe it or not, lower, in the 300s. But this wasn't always the case. From 2007 to 2018, deaths by law enforcement, those deemed justifiable, were between 400 and 500, and ones by private citizens ranged from the mid-200s to mid-300s. So kind of an interesting shift, which got me thinking. Most of these involved firearms, and I suspected the increase in private citizens claiming self-defense or justifiable homicide was based partly on the expanded stand your ground laws, or make my day laws, as what I remember the first one in Colorado being called, allowing the fearful to arm themselves and actually use them. And sure enough, studies do show increased murder rates following the implementation of stand your ground laws. It's not that the victim is different, that it's you or the intruder, but actual increase in homicides. In some areas of the country, as much as 33%. And just the loosening of gun laws in general has certainly increased the number of those claiming self-defense. These lax gun policies tend to prioritize a person's perceived fear over public safety. And this notion of good guys with guns is also being used as a justifiable excuse to carry, which, again, often leads to claims of self-defense. I mean, look no further than the Trayvon Martin case, and so many more. It's a dangerously simplistic myth, I think, that promotes a vigilante approach to safety, encouraging people, anyone, to take justice into their own hands rather than rely on de-escalation, law enforcement, or community-based solutions. I mean, there are people who shouldn't even operate a can opener, let alone a deadly firearm. I just think normalizing the presence of firearms in everyday spaces fosters a false sense of security that leads to more violence, not less, and make it easier to justify the use of deadly force, even in avoidable confrontations that are based on a subjective perception of threat, which can be influenced by fear, bias, or poor judgment. And studies bear that out. It's the law of instrument, right? When you carry a hammer, everything looks like a nail. All right, so I'll give that a rest. Next episode is going to be another freebie bonus. You may recall in episode 3, the Ivan Kovalev case, I mentioned an up-and-coming Sacramento detective in the early 1890s, and his gift to law enforcement, and really to the state of California, was his seemingly photographic memory. He had a very long career in Sacramento and figured into many of these Folsom cases, first officially entering the scene in 1902 with the investigation of Folsom's 16th execution. So I wanted to bring his story in first. And I have wanted to tell his story for years, and I think you'll see why. So thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Falling Into the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on the show page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll also find links to YouTube and to Patreon, where I provide bonus material, including bonus episodes. I'll release 1 to 2 new episodes each month, always on Fridays, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.